It's nice to see everyone, even through these electronic platforms. I apologize again for having to send in a recording for today, but I will actually be there live at the North York Community House at 3 p.m. today. So anyone who's around, hope that you can come say hello and visit for a bit, maybe have a cup of tea. But I'm in Toronto. I'm actually at a Airbnb just near a studio where I will be, I'm just in the process of taping my audiobook, which is what I'll be doing for today. And wasn't able to make it a live presentation for you for today, but I will make it for in the next few weeks. So I've got a couple presentations left. So according to my calculations, we've got 3 sessions left, and then we had kind of a 4th session, which was intended to be a Q&A session. I'm afraid I have ceremonies during that time, so we're just going to do 3 more sessions left. So we have today, which is April 18th, and then we have, so today will be on health, and then May 9th, which will be on justice, and then May 30th, which will be what I call the future, and what I sort of looking towards all the different sessions that we've brought up to this point, all the different topics. And I'll be talking a little bit about what we have in front of us and what it is that we are facing in the next few years, particularly when we consider the fact that next year is a federal election, and there probably will be a radically different approach to the ways in which Indigenous peoples are treated by this country. Presumably, if all the polls are correct, it's going to be a change election. And so we may be looking at a different party and a different set of ideas. I'll be talking a little bit about that in the final session. So the final session is going to be May 30th. Just so that you can get a sort of sense. And oddly enough, that's the day that my book will be launched, the one that I'm taping for today. And so exciting time, very busy time. And like I said, I'm in Toronto. I'll be there today at 3 p.m. We're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous health today, and what it is that we're talking about when we talk about Indigenous health. I was out yesterday with a group of teachers in north of Toronto, and we were talking about this very topic. We were talking about what it constitutes Indigenous health, like what it would be if we were to say a healthy person or a healthy individual within an Indigenous community. So obviously, we would say things like, well, somebody who's eating properly, someone who isn't sick, someone who is able to do all the things necessary to be able to live a full and complete life. And it's that last point that I really want us to think a little bit about. You know, oftentimes when we think about health, we think about hospitals, and we think about medicine, and we think about seeing a doctor. But that's not really where Indigenous health begins. Indigenous health is about proactive approaches rather than reactive approaches. And what I mean by that is when we think a little bit about what constitutes Indigenous health, it's actually the everyday. It's those things that make you feel secure, good, ultimately have a sense of balance amongst your body and your mind and your heart and your spirit. It is health for an Indigenous person, traditionally, in a traditional sense, involves proactive approaches. Means that the things that we do every single day, from the moment that we wake up and even before that when we dream, to all the way until we go to sleep again when we dream again. So the entirety of what happens in all of that constitutes Indigenous health. You're going to start to notice that that's also a theme when I talk about Indigenous justice, which is the session we're going to talk about in a few weeks, or when we talk about youth, because it is all of those things that involve teaching, that involve articulating society and articulating governance and decision-making processes. Health is the most critical aspect of Indigenous life because, as they say, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. So what is it that I'm talking about when we talk about Indigenous health? Well, uh, I'll tell a story. There is a kind of way to imagine what is illness. And illness is not just something about like when you have the flu, but or when you're sick. And we know that because when the COVID-19 pandemic hit Indigenous communities, were people concerned about the flu, concerned about the tremendous issues involving breathing and sickness and fever, and whether there'd be a safe environment for elders, for example, in which they could quarantine themselves? Like all of that is critically important. But by far, one of the most important things that Indigenous peoples were thinking about during the COVID-19 pandemic was around laughter. And a good example of that is if you went on TikTok, if you went on any of those social media platforms that you saw where Indigenous peoples were either at a check stop protecting their community, or whether they were at home, like all the rest of us, sort of thinking about like how do we protect ourselves from this terrible virus, uh, or whether they were out and about doing their everyday tasks, being the chief, being the police, being the nurse of their community. Uh, there was a cacophony, an explosion of videos that were kind of talking about the humorous side. And there's very little funny things about COVID-19, but you'd see things like, for example, dance-offs at check stops between each other. You'd see like jig-offs, meaning jigging, people jigging and challenging each other. You even saw uh, after when the sort of pandemic started to roll down a little bit, and you saw a great rise in youth suicide after people had been at home for a long period of time, people who had had conflict within their communities, and that conflict was permeating, and it was leading to youth that were hurting themselves. You saw this explosion of men, Indigenous men, large Indigenous men, wearing mermaid tails, right about the time that The Little Mermaid came out, and sort of sunbathing on rocks and then posting pictures of being mermen. And it was mostly to make people laugh, particularly those young people who were in the process of harming themselves. And it was that lesson, which is that laughter is one of the most important aspects of creating health in a community, is how I want you to think about Indigenous health. I want you to think of it as not just in terms of the way correctives can happen, like medicine, or when you go to a doctor and they put a cast on your leg, or when you go to a hospital and they have you, look down your throat or look X-ray inside of you, or, it's not just about diagnosing. That's not what health is ultimately all about. That's a part of it, but it's about saying, how can we make sure that we are healthy tomorrow, next week, next month? And so that means that almost every single practice in a community is about health. It's about trying to determine what it is that we are creating in a relationship in a locality. And that necessarily involves things like geography, resources, relationships. Do we feel safe? Do we feel comfortable? Are things working adequately? Are we effectively communicating with each other? And that's what Indigenous health ultimately is engaged in or invested in. I've often said that in the child welfare system, so we have a tremendous problem in Indigenous communities around child welfare, around the number of children that have been forcibly removed. And they've been forcibly removed, as you know, after studying Cindy Blackstock's work. They've been removed mostly because of poverty, violence, and long-standing policies and laws that have driven Indigenous communities into tremendously bad experiences. And so as a result, the children that you see in the child welfare system in particularly Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, where the child welfare system is 90% Indigenous, the problem isn't that Indigenous families are inadequate or unable to care for their children. It's that they've been traumatized and they've been put into a situation of failure because they can't provide things like services. So no surprise, a child welfare worker comes in, looks at a family, goes, oh, well, you're not treating these children appropriately. You're not feeding them appropriately. You're not making sure they go to school, all of these things. And then we're going to take away the children. The child welfare system is a reactive system. It's a system that's intended to, for the most part, it's actually incentivized, it's encouraged to legitimate itself. And one of the main ways it legitimates itself, which is to remove children. That's oftentimes what the child welfare system says, well, this is what we're here to do, and this is what we're built upon. And back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and in many ways still today, financially incentivize individuals to legitimate their work and therefore remove children. Because if you were a child welfare worker who didn't remove any children, then what job would you have? How would you get paid? So the child welfare system is a reactive system, and so is health. Health is a reactive system in Canada. It's like if a doctor had nobody sick, then who would pay their bills? What would they do all day? So it's almost like a doctor needs people to be sick. And so therefore, the idea of sickness is constantly something that's being diagnosed and obsessed upon. That's not what Indigenous communities are there to do. In fact, I would say that what would cure the child welfare situation, this abundance of Indigenous children that have been forcibly removed, is a youth center or an after-school program that supports families, that encourages people to eat properly and eat in such a way that, and that means you have to have a grocery store on that First Nation, not just a convenience store or gas station where a banana's like $6 and a chocolate bar is $2. Like, it's far more important to have infrastructure on a First Nation, and that will be what will deal with health far more than a child welfare worker. Let me say that again. So I think, and I've put forth the position that if you want to cure the child welfare system, remove children less and have more pancake breakfasts, have more camps where fathers and mothers and children and grandparents and elders and aunties and uncles all get together and go tobogganing or sledding or skiing together or play hockey together or whatever, play volleyball together, whatever, spend time together. That's what will cure the child welfare system, which is to be proactive. Now, traditionally, I would say do ceremony together. Because ceremony is ultimately a relational activity that's based in the notion of locality, of knowledge within a space. And when that takes place, people engage that, share that knowledge, work together, and then ultimately produce an aspect of health. Like every single ceremony that Indigenous peoples perform is about health. It's like, for example, let me give an example of, let's say, a naming ceremony. So when somebody wants a traditional name, so what they'll do is they'll go to an elder, a knowledge keeper, a language speaker, and they'll work with that person often through tobacco. So they'll offer some tobacco, and that person will then go away and think and fast and vision about the name of that person, and then come back, and that person will then sit with that elder, and then there will be a story that will be shared, which will be shared with that person and also their sponsors, those who are sitting with them, who will try their best to remember that story, to work together to make sure that the name is remembered. And then finally, that elder will announce the name to 4 different directions of creation. This is a process ultimately about health. When a young person doesn't have a name or a traditional name, they may, or an older person for that matter, because many of us, learn our names or later in life, we feel empty inside. We feel with less purpose. We don't know what our role or connection with community is. And so we may feel sad or depressed, or we may feel disconnected, which may lead to feelings of depression, or may lead to feelings of inadequacy or shame or anxiety. And ultimately, you can't live your life if you don't know your name, if you don't have the ability. You can't live your life to the fullest way that it can be. And so when that name is spoken, in all the different things that took place. Remember the tobacco, the fasting, the visioning, the elder relationship with the person who's being asked for the name, and then ultimately the announcement of that name. All of those things are ultimately about health, because at the end of the day, when that young person or that new person or that named person is spoken, when that name is spoken to all the directions of creation, it means that in our ceremony, in our story, it's said that the person's face becomes clear to all of creation. And so that ceremony is ultimately about creating clarity for somebody. It's about giving someone a face that can be recognized by not just humans, but the trees, the directions, the birds, the fish, the animals, all the different spirits that exist within creation can now suddenly see you as clear. So that they couldn't see you before. It's the story sort of describes it as you're seen somewhat blurry. And then when your name is spoken, it becomes clear. Now, everybody needs a name. And when you have a name, then you understand your purpose, which is why oftentimes our names are about what we are to do. So my name, Niigaan means the sound of the future, or the sound of the person who leads at the front, the sound of the front. And so that means that this is something that I have to live up to every day. I have to try to be the sound at the front, or the sound that announces things. And so Nigaan, that's what my name is intending for me to mean. It gives me clarity and purpose, and ultimately tells me how to act, or how to be, or how to find my reason for being. I tell you all that because what I've just done is describe to you a practice of health. And for health is not just about getting a pill, and then suddenly that pill makes me feel better, because the pill will wear off. It may make me feel better temporarily, but that pill won't give me a sense of purpose. It won't give me a sense of meaning. What it'll do is maybe help me to ascertain some of that, but ultimately I have to find that myself. And that's what Indigenous health is intending to do. Indigenous health is intending to give sustainable, reciprocal, long-standing practices to be able to give people a sense of balance. And that sense of balance has four parts: the mind, the body, the heart, the spirit. So in our creation story, we talk about these different parts of ourselves, often called a bundle. And then in that bundle, we say, okay, there's different parts of who we are, and you don't have to look very far to think of yourself. You know, we all have different parts of our body, things that do different things, things that are in communication with each other, but yet sometimes can be off balance. If one is off balance, then everything's off balance. And so we'll start with your mind. Every single one of us thinks, and one of our great gifts is the ability to vision and to dream. And all of that happens from your brain and the activity that happens within your brain. But very closely related to that is your body and all the things that are connected to your body. But your body often takes direction from your brain. But we know that if your body isn't healthy, then your brain also can't achieve everything that it needs to achieve. So making sure you eat good food, that you treat your body well, that you wash yourself, that you care for yourself, that you dress nicely, that all of those things that take care of your body, that you make sure that you're proud of all the different parts of who you are. Even if you have a body that might be look different than others, that your body is complex and beautiful in all that it was intended to be. There's no body that was intended to be one way or two ways. We have bodies that look differently everywhere. Every body looks different. And everybody looks different, but every body looks different too. And that's what makes humanity the most beautiful thing of all, amongst many others. Because if you look to creation, like there's no tree looks the same either. No bear, two bears, you can see two bears and they look different too. Fish from the same species look different. They're often related to the geography and the space around them, and all the things that that fish or bear or tree is doing with its life. It has a meaning and a purpose. And so all of us, by looking differently in our bodies, there is no body that is more beautiful than another. They are all beautiful, and they are beautiful in their specificity and also together in their collectivity. Because one of the things that we learn is that by seeing different people, it's a great teacher of creation, that everything has meaning, or everything, there's multiple ways to think of the same thing. And that all of these things that involve our bodies, the amazing things that they do, they can jump, they can run, they can sing songs, they can make other life. Our bodies are amazing things. And so our mind and our body, but there's other parts to our lives too, because it's not just about living and it's not just about thinking, it's about having a reason to think. It's about that feeling that you have inside of you that maybe drives you to do what you're doing. And that's where we get into the heart, or one of the most important parts of our body and our mind. And we know that those things would be nowhere without your heart. Your heart is the reason that you do things. It's the feeling that you have that makes you driven to do what you do. If you want to be an artist, for example, it's your heart that drives you. You have to do this. Or if you are sad and you are upset about something, it's your heart that drives you to do something to try to rectify that, to engage that, or to try to heal that in some way. It's your heart that makes you fall in love. It's your heart that also makes you feel anxious and nervous about things because you are caring so deeply about something. So we've got three parts: mind, body, heart. But then there's this other part of us, and this is what we often call in Anishinaabe the Manitoba, or the word that means mystery, because we don't quite understand it, but we know that it is there because we feel a purpose in everything. We feel sort of an interconnectedness. There are things we can't explain, things that we see just slightly. One of the characteristics of the Manitoba, or the mystery, or what we often call the spirit, is that we only get to see a small part. It's like we never get to see the fullness of it. So there's many spiritual beings in creation. And for Anishinaabe, we talk about these spiritual beings all the time. In fact, there's certain times of the year you're not supposed to talk about certain spiritual beings, and because of the ways in which they need to rest too. And there's other times when we need to work with other spirits. Like for instance, this is the period of Niigaan, which is the spirit of spring. And it's this time period in which we don't really talk so much about that previous spirit. In English, we would say the spirit of winter, and we wouldn't call out the name of that being in Anishinaabe, because we wouldn't want that being's now sleeping. That snow, that winter being is sleeping, so we don't want to call out that name, because if so, he would wake up, and I'm sure we don't really want too much snow and winter to come around. And so Niigaan, this beautiful being of spring, she takes good care of us at this time of the year. So spirit is really what I'm ultimately talking about. So mind, body, heart, spirit, those four parts of who Anishinaabe are, that we each have connections to that. We have elements that are within all of us. This is a really important thing that I haven't talked a lot about, but I'll talk about just briefly right now, which is that there is no religion for Indigenous peoples. In the hundreds and hundreds of communities, there is no religion traditionally for in the sense that we know of as religion. There's no like conversion into becoming a Shawnee person, or a Haudenosaunee person. Like, you can't opt into it. You have to have relationality. There's sometimes that's through ancestry, but most oftentimes it's through relationship or earning that relationship with the community. And so most times that you have a relationality with the community, it means that you do it through action. So that's what constitutes Indigenous spirituality, which there is no religion, there's no book that you can go out and memorize and then choose to convert into a Indigenous community or culture or tribe. Uh, there's no Indigenous religion that you can sort of point to and go, okay, well, that's something that you just learn enough of it, and then you can opt into it and do something about personal choice. It's actually far more about community, and it's about far more the ways in which we do actions to benefit, to work with, to become a member of that community. And that's what's often called the spirit. So the spirit is not something that is it's not something that's ethereal, like something that's like religion where you have to believe it. Spirit is something that's earned. And a good example would be laughter, telling a joke. That's the spirit of laughter, or the spirit of love when you do something nice for someone else and you feel the spirit of that love that is present, or the spirit of collectivity or community. And that's often done when somebody presents a gift to another and you engage that together to make a decision, for example, or to come forth to make a plan to deal with something in a community, like, let's say, the flood is coming. And so when that gift is given and people decide to work together, even people who maybe don't like each other, it is the spirit of community, the spirit of collectivity that comes forward. And you'll see that particularly in ceremony, like, for example, in a sweat lodge, everybody gets to speak. And that is the spirit of community, that everybody presents their gift to each other. Even people who don't even agree will get together, and when they do ceremony together, will commit to listening to each other. Okay, so we've discovered that Indigenous health is about the balance of four things: mind, body, heart, spirit. Now, I can't really tell you how Indigenous health works. I can't be like, oh, there's happening right there. I can't do that for you. What I can do is say, you know it when it's happening. It's experiential, as they say, meaning that it's like you have to do it. And it's health is always in the process of becoming. It's never become. And what I mean is that health is like something you're dealing with every single day and every single moment. Um, it's not that health just just happens because you take a pill, or that you go to a therapy session, or that you go get your leg put into a cast. It's not suddenly you're healthy. For Indigenous peoples, health is like a lifelong endeavor. It's something that happens and you work on every single day. So, for example, when you wake up in the morning and you just have this amazing dream that you had the night before, sometimes you have to tell people about this dream. Sometimes you have to share or reflect upon what that dream meant to you. Sometimes you have to just feel what that dream means, and sometimes you have to think about what the broader purpose. What's the mystery that was offered with that dream? And if you noticed, I just did mind, body, heart, spirit. That it's about trying to figure out all the different parts of what something means. And that's why, for example, we start in the morning time as Anishinaabe with very important protocol ceremonies that we do every single day when we get together. And those involve things like fire and water. And we recognize that these critical parts to our lives of warmth and medicine, these are parts of what our health lays, but they're also part of much bigger purposes. They're also for governance, the things that we've been talking about in this series. There are things like justice, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks. So, so health is intricately tied with all of these things together. And I think oftentimes in Canadian society, we think to ourselves, oh, well, health is separate to justice, or health is separate to government. In fact, we often at times are encouraged to think that way, because we'll say things like, we have to separate. We say, we want government to not be involved in education, or let's be more even bigger. So we want to say that our spiritual places should have nothing to do with any of the other institutions in our country, like for instance, schooling, or for schooling is somewhat debatable. In Ontario, religion and schooling is very closely tight with the Catholic school system. Let me give up with a better example. We shouldn't be doing certain spiritual practices within, we'll say, development, like the infrastructure department, building highways, for example. We'd be like, oh, those things are separate. Not for Indigenous peoples. And so for Indigenous peoples, all of those different parts of ourselves, the mind, body, heart, spirit, are intricately tied with everything that we do. We can't opt into and decide, oh, well, our health justice practices, our child welfare practices are without these senses of meaning, these larger senses of thinking about balance. So that means it's critically important to do things to do things involving health for every aspect of our engagement with the broader world and within our nations and societies too. So it's like trying to begin to describe Indigenous health is almost impossible, but I can tell you what it looks like, and I can tell you when it's happening. So if we were doing things together, I'd be like, okay, it's happening now. But for me to describe it to you is almost like trying to describe a painting. There's only so much I can describe when I have to sort of tell you that you have to experience it and you have to witness it. You have to engage with it. A song, a dance, that's what health is. Health is all of those things together. Now, effective healing practices for Indigenous peoples are really about fostering the ability to continue to build communities and nations. So it's about collectivity. It's about bringing people together. And so oftentimes you'll hear this word healing. When I was growing up, this is the thing that I heard the most, that this is a healing ceremony, or this is a healing practice, or Indigenous peoples just need more healing. And so these are things that you most often heard when I was growing up, especially when we would be going to the Friendship Center, or we'd be going to a big meeting of some kind, or we'd be going to a powwow. And in fact, that would be the number one thing I'd always hear on the announcer, would be like, this is a healing dance. So I sort of had this stereotype growing up that Indigenous peoples were constantly harmed, or were definitely in a state of like never-ending sadness or ill health, or like I was like, why do they always need healing? It's because healing is not a corrective, like it's not a reactive thing. And that's what we often think of as healing. We've been conditioned to think of healing as the way in which you go to a doctor, you have a broken leg, and they cast it, and then you're healed. That's not how Indigenous peoples think of as healing. Healing is actually a proactive practice. Healing is about getting up in the morning, having a good breakfast, going outside, taking your kids for a walk. It's about engaging them with other peoples. It might be going to ceremony and doing those protocols I talked about earlier. It might just be telling somebody I love them when you drop them off at school. Healing is about being a proactive approach towards a good life, or what's often called Minobamadzawin, which is the good life. So all the things necessary to live a good life, and very few of that involves taking a pill, or having a therapist tell you, do this and do that, or breathe properly. Like those things are important. Those are a part of it. But Indigenous health is far more proactive than reactive. Sometimes you got to do reactive things to get back into balance, but Indigenous health is far more interested in kind of the everyday, like the everyday things that will lead you towards a good life. Like, for example, probably one of the most important things that we all should do is take time. Take the time necessary to do all the things to make you proud of yourself, to make you happy. Reflect, or as I grow older in my life, I've really learned the power of meditation and breathing and taking the time necessary to really appreciate the things that are happening around me. Uh, and it's that gives me meaning and purpose or balance amongst my mind, my body, my heart, my spirit. So just breathing properly, looking around, stopping in this very fast world where you're encouraged to move faster and faster and faster, and social media and react, and uh, it is so crucial in our lives that we stop, we breathe, we think, we reflect, and then we decide what it is that we want to do next. And that's the process of healing that I'm talking about. Healing is not about just, I think it's a big part of it, but it's not just about having a cry, but you'll hear people say, oh, I just, that was very healing to cry like that. But healing is actually about proaction. It's about saying, I love you. It's about holding somebody's hand. It's about fostering in a young person the ability for that person to be able to withstand anything that will happen to them in their life, whether they're followed in a 7-Eleven, or whether they get a failing grade on a test, or whether they feel nervous and upset when they can't speak their traditional language in some way. And that healing is ultimately, my mother used to use this term, although some people don't like it anymore, is a sense of resilience, so that that person can continue on and continue to do that. That's what ultimately Indigenous healing is all about. Now, I'm going to get to a bit of reality here for just a minute. Now, the reality is that Indigenous people's health is not in a great state according to all the different parameters and marks of what we can constitute to be health in the country. All of those things are fine and good. And for me to describe what traditional health is and Indigenous health is, I want to spend the next few minutes talking a little bit about the situation of Indigenous health in the country. Because if you go to a hospital, if you were to go to Winnipeg right now, then go to the Health Science Center in downtown, which is the main hospital in Winnipeg, you'd be like, this emergency room is full of Indigenous peoples. And this surgical unit is full of Indigenous peoples. This palliative care unit is full of Indigenous peoples. You'd start to notice something, especially then if you travel to a First Nation, you'd be like, why are there diseases and sicknesses there that exist nowhere else except for in places like Africa or Asia or South America, or places that are often deemed to be not the kind of infrastructure or health infrastructure that exists in Canada. Why is it that there's a higher rate of diabetes in First Nations or Métis communities? Why is it that there's a bigger mortality rate, meaning people die earlier and younger? Why is it there's so much cardiovascular disease or obesity or cancer or stroke or suicide or accidents or homicide? The life expectancy of First Nations people is about 5 to 7 years less than most Canadians. That's for males and for females. So for males, it's about 69 years old you're expected to die. So that means I have about 20 years left to live, 22 years or so left to live. If you're female, it's about 76, 77. For an Indigenous person, there's a reason why that is, that there's a higher mortality rate, there's a higher infant mortality rate. And the reality is why there's more infectious disease or chronic disease within communities. And it has to do, for the most part, with laws and policies that have been instilled onto Indigenous communities. The reality is that the most common cause of death for First Nations is injury and poisoning. And oftentimes, if you're under 10, the highest rate of death is unintentional accidents. Sometimes those are also related to suicide rates, because the suicide rate for First Nations is 5 to 7 times higher than Canadian rates. So this is not to mention things like mortality rates that have impacted particularly Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples, also some youth, because in Indigenous communities, the mortality rate for those groups are 3 times the rate, even 4 and 5 times the rate as any other in the community. In fact, an undiagnosed or perhaps least talked about issue is the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous boys and men, because that's about 3 to 4 times higher the rate of the already exponential, out of control rate of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples. So men and boys are killed and go missing more often than Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples, but we don't call them murdered and missing. So, for example, if a young Indigenous boy is killed on a First Nation, murdered on a First Nation, we'll often say, "Oh, well, that was just a house party fight," or that person was killed in a car accident after drinking and driving, for example. We don't say things like murdered or missing. We don't use the definition of murdered or missing when we use boys oftentimes, but we do when it comes to women. And that has a lot to do with how we characterize women and how we characterize men. The bottom line of it is that there's a whole lot of people who are suffering from things that end their lives early, that impact their everyday health. And I haven't even got to the issue of diabetes or cardiovascular disease or the issue of depression, mental health on First Nations, on Indigenous communities, urban Indigenous communities. Like, did you know that most First Nations have about 90% do not have suitable mental health services, meaning that people who regularly come into that community who can provide access to support for, let's say, depression or bipolar disorder or things like anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, those kinds of things that we take for granted in the city just simply don't exist on First Nations or in the inner city where Indigenous peoples tend to reside, in areas that are often chronically underfunded. And never mind the fact that these are often food deserts. So when I say a food desert means lack of fresh food or affordable food. So that means that you're probably going to be diabetic. We're more likely to be diabetic if you're in a First Nations community or an urban Indigenous community because you don't have access to fresh food, fresh fruit, vegetables, or decent meat. And so what you're doing is you're eating cured meat or cheap sandwich meat, or you're drinking Coca-Cola instead of drinking water because for some reason your water isn't available in your community, or you can't afford a good home that has decent pipes to provide you with that water. Okay, so what I've just explained to you is that poverty is the problem, or laws that have created poverty on First Nations is the problem. That's what's created the detrimental issue of health, and also the residential school period and a draconian of violent policies which brought violence to Indigenous communities, which is now permeating within those communities, because oftentimes many Indigenous peoples continue to be traumatized, and traumatized people share their trauma. And so oftentimes that means that children are removed from their homes. That means that there is mortality rates amongst men who may be using alcohol or drugs, or maybe in some way or another are performing crime in their community, which are harming others. We certainly saw that in the issue of James Smith out in Saskatchewan, James Smith Nation. Never mind in Manitoba, all the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. But ultimately, the real problem is youth suicide. I mean, youth suicide is such a tremendous challenge because it's not just about when a young person harms themselves and dies. It's about the family that is afterwards. It's about the friends that witnessed or that are missing or that are impacted by that young person's death. It's about the entire community now harmed as a result of realizing that within one of their very own, that a person would choose to end their life instead of continuing it. And all of this relates with health. All of this relates with the necessity of considering trauma as the most important impact of Indigenous lives. I've often said that we can build as many beautiful roads, buildings. We can come up with the most innovative business ideas. We can create Indigenous areas, Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations as these economic hubs, come up with brilliant, amazing ideas. In fact, I think one of the most strongest ideas these days is around urban reserve development in cities. They can create commercial spaces that create economic possibilities for Indigenous communities. Radically brilliant ideas, but it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter how many brilliant ideas we come up with. It doesn't matter how many nice houses we build. It really doesn't matter how many projects that we build that are innovative and brilliant and strong. If people are still traumatized, they're not going to be able to live their fullest lives. If they have their mind, their body, their heart, their spirit not in balance, if we do not take care of all of those parts, as we move forward to be able to employ these important ideas or build these beautiful roads, or then ultimately trauma will envelop, overcome, and take over all those parts within a society. And I think a good evidence of that is you'll often hear this phrase of, oh, Indigenous communities destroy things, or young people come in and they tear down a building, or they harm each other. Or in Winnipeg, there was this beautiful building called the Native Friendship Center in the downtown core. And for decades, it did important work supporting families. It was a meeting place. It was a place where people could go play bingo or have coffee or do their youth programming. In fact, for many years, they had a daycare that would help and support parents who needed their children cared for in a culturally important environment. But what happened is, for years and years and years, the poverty of the surrounding area, the crime that had been neglected or that had been over-policed, meaning the police were creating this trauma. The challenge ultimately is that the Friendship Center then eventually started to become enveloped by trauma that was coming in the building, that was starting to infect people's relationships within the building, workers, the board. And then eventually what happened is people who, for their own safety, decided to not be involved with the center anymore. And that center started to become a place of great challenges, a place of violence. And ultimately that building had to be torn down because of all the different things that had happened within that space. People started to live in that building, people started to steal from that building, and then ultimately a whole bunch of different challenges took place. But it wasn't the fault of the building or the programs or the people that were involved. It was the huge issue that Canada has created of driving Indigenous communities into trauma, into poverty, and into cycles of those abuse, and having them undiagnosed, unchallenged, unsupported. And that for a long period of time, Canada has simply just refused to clean up the mess that it created by the residential school period, by the period of banning ceremonies and dress, or making languages not spoken publicly, or creating the issue in which children are forcibly removed from families, that communities are over-policed. And so Canada continues to perpetrate trauma, 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 trauma. And so no surprise, Indigenous communities are 4 times more likely to experience severe trauma than any non-Indigenous peoples. So First Nations, Inuit, Métis people experience 4 times more trauma than anybody else, or what we call deep trauma or large-scale trauma. Now, people who experience trauma tend to use more, when I mean alcohol and drugs. They tend to be suffering from mental health challenges more. They tend to be experiencing things like atrophy or feelings of disconnection or unemployment. And so what I've just done is I've just explained to you that the challenge ultimately is health is our challenge, but the answer is in turning more to what I spoke about at the very beginning, which is for an Indigenous person, health is about the proactive approaches, not the reactive approaches. It's about pancake breakfasts. It's about saying, I love you. And so one of the things that we do, and I've spoken to you about this before, is in Manitoba, we engage these practices in our everyday frontline work with communities. And so, for example, one of the things that we do is with the Mama Bear Clan is we go out to communities and we make sure that we provide them with the sandwich and with resources necessary. We also promote safety through our patrols. But one of the most important things that we do is we tell people that we love them. We say, I love you, brother, or we call people by their names. We remember who they are and what kind of sandwich they like. And we bring the sandwich to them as opposed to making people stand in line. We respect people. We say, you matter. That will be what will cure people who are homeless. That will be what will cure people who are traumatized. That will cure far more people who are suffering from ill health than any pill will ever do, or any doctor will ever do, or any institution will ever do. It is that part, dealing with mental health and trauma, that is the most undiagnosed part. But then once we get there, we have to realize that there needs to be a balance between mind, body, heart, spirit, and then that will be what will be a corrective. That balance will be the corrective that is needed, that will help our cities grow, that will help First Nations, Inuit communities grow, Métis communities grow, and that ultimately will be how about we will stop this incredible expenditure, this incredible amount of money that we are continuing to commit over and over again to not really dealing with the problem. Like, for example, I just had a student, and I'll end off with this story. I just had a student who finished a PhD. And one of the things that she noticed when she was a nurse was that every single First Nations mother who wants to have a child has to face the reality that they're going to have to fly out of their community, fly hundreds of miles south to a city to have their own child. So from the first moment of birth, a child doesn't get to have connection with their community, doesn't get to be on the land that their ancestors were, doesn't get to hear the language that they know that will connect them with the community and the ancestors and the culture and the nation that exists within that space. You have to fly hundreds of miles. So she said that I'm going to study this, the ways in which traditional birthing took place, the way that grandmothers used to lead that practice, or what she called Indigenous doulas or Indigenous midwifery. And how Indigenous peoples can repossess birthing. And she started a project and she worked with other women to be able to bring birthing back to certain communities in the North. And what she noticed is that the entire health of the community become there were actually measurables when elders saw children, when they worked with the birthing of those children. They noticed that children were attending school more, that those, therefore, their families had less anxiety. They noticed that there was a general overall health in interest in the ways in which people were treating each other. And then she noticed the first of all, which is that the government ran more efficiently, because when birthing practices started in a community, there was a sense of interest, engagement, and ultimately empowerment within the community that then led a government to act more efficiently and to become more advocate, particularly for issues of like making sure food is affordable or making sure that projects are delivered and programs are delivered. My student realized that birthing, by making sure birthing is available in a community, a basic human right, being able to have your child within your family and your community and your nation, things that you, as a person in a city, person who is in Canadian society, a person that you and I, things we just take for granted, which is that we can have a child in this community by giving that back, by recognizing, by supporting a community to gain that practice back, that the overall health of everybody, the mind, the body, the heart, the spirit, was raised, and that everybody became successful by the act of engaging and the everyday, supporting the everyday, to make sure that Indigenous communities can just do basic human rights, basic things that we all take for granted. And it is those in which I want to end off for today by saying that, Indigenous health is not something that is going to involve tens of billions of dollars. Is there going to be some infrastructure issues? Yes. Is there going to be some challenges that we need to stop and think about, and ways in which provincial systems, federal systems are evoking more and more trauma? We need to make money to pay money to change all of those systems. Yes, absolutely. But it's not really a cost issue. It's an issue of an attitude issue of, do we recognize that Indigenous health must be in the hands of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous health practitioners who are really the everyday. They're often the grandparents, the ceremony people, the people who are the leaders within a community, and that ultimately that there's an Indigenous health practice that is right in front of us. And it's probably in I love you more than anything else. And that I love you might just be how we get out of this tremendous black hole of youth suicide epidemics, murder and missing Indigenous women, girls, boys, men, two-spirit peoples, and this tremendous situation, tremendously terrible situation involving rampant problems of health in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. With that, I say a big miigwech and thank you to you all. I will be at the North York Community House in just a couple hours once I finish my recording. You'll be able to watch this, and I probably will be wearing the same shirt. And I will see you all this afternoon at 3 p.m. And so if you come by and have a tea and have a visit, I will come by and say hello. And so big miigwech and thanks very much. And like I said, the next two sessions, May 9th, May 30th, we're going to talk a little bit about justice, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the future. So I look forward to those two final sessions after this, when we'll wrap up our year. Miigwech, everybody, and a big thanks to you.